Welcome to the discussion of personal relationships. This comes from Wood, Chapter 10. So a quick brain refresh to get you thinking about previous concepts. Tell me, what are the 4 attachment styles? What is direct definition versus social comparison? And how can you be supportive of others' self-disclosures? So we're going to call on a few different concepts here. These are ones that should appear in your notes. If they don't, you definitely need to go back and revisit the information. The focus questions for this chapter are: what is the typical process of friendship development? How do romantic relationships typically escalate and deteriorate? To what extent are long-term romantic relationships equitable for men and women? And what is the cycle of intimate partner violence? We actually will have a separate supplemental lecture on the cycle of intimate partner violence and controlling and abusive relationships because it's an important topic worth a discussion all its own. When we talk about types of relationships, we have social relationships, which are interactions according to general social roles. So your bank teller, your coffee barista, the janitor, the people who you're interacting with the function rather than the individual person. We also then have personal relationships, which are interactions according to the unique individual person, right? So family members, friends, professors after you've known them for a while. We've talked about relationships being dynamic, right? So our interactions with people change over time. So for instance, a professor may start as a social role. Okay, this is the person who just happened to be named when I signed up for this list, and then a year or two later says, wow, I really like that professor, I've chosen to take several classes with them. Now they've gone from a social relationship to a personal relationship because you're interacting with them based on their individual identities rather than the function that they fulfill. So what makes for a personal relationship? There are 5 different pieces here it's important to know. So personal relationships are unique. These are irreplaceable individuals. There's a sense of commitment. You have made the decision to remain in the relationship, right? So you seek out that professor. You put in work to your partner, right? All of these pieces. Rules. Within our relationships, we develop our own regulative and constitutive rules. And so our relationship is different, right, between the 2 of us or the 5 of us than it is between, right, those 2 or those 5 people. Our relationships are always affected by context, and so it's affected by the situation, both how the relationship is formed, how we enact it, how it might end, but also what are the rules for it. And crucial here, and where we're going to spend most of our lecture, is this idea that relational dialectics exist. Relational dialectics always exist in relationships. And so if they're there, it's probably a personal relationship. I'll give you some more detail about that in a moment. So all of our relationships go through stages. Big picture, I want you to know that relationships, whether they be friendship, romance, right, whatever kind of intimate relationship you have, we escalate, then we have to navigate them, and then they often deteriorate. And so you can see there a set of steps symbolizing how we gradually move up, but then can also move back down, step back up again, right? They're really pretty fluid how that happens, but these are the 3 major categories of stages in relationships that you need to know. It's also crucial that you take into account that relationships take work. Relationships change over time. One of the worst things that you can do to have a successful romantic relationship is to watch a lot of romantic comedies and expect that that's what it's supposed to look like, right? That it's supposed to be this sense of if you meet the right person, it's easy and you just know it, right? In reality, relationships take a lot of work. Your relationship is going to change over time. Your relationship is going to be hard. And they take a lot of maintenance, right? But it's good to enjoy the change, even embrace the change, but don't run from it or necessarily think something's broken just because that change has happened. So there's a great article from September in 2014 in the Huffington Post about why it takes more than love for your relationship to work out, where the author actually went and surveyed folks who had been in long-term relationships and said, you know, if it's not always love, what is it? Kind of how have you experienced these long-term relationships? And you get a great range of answers that demonstrate how relationships are so individual and how there's no quick formula. And in general, there's no quick anything. It's not easy. It can be great, but not easy. So the book mentions turning points in relationships. We've talked about escalating, navigating, and deteriorating. So I've offered you this chart, just kind of as a blank chart, to demonstrate that relationships can work differently, right? So let's say these guys are friends, like super intense, right after they meet, spend a lot of time together, and maybe they start hanging out with others, then they get in this big fight that they're hanging out with others, and so they really just aren't talking, aren't doing anything. Then they realize they want to start hanging out again. That kind of sticks around for a while. Get really good again, stays good for a while, maybe drops down a little, but they're ending in a pretty good place, right? Or perhaps start higher with a slower incline about how much time you spend together. Maybe you drop even further over time, right? You go up and then you think everything's over, you get in this huge fight, but then maybe you go to counseling or you discover something else about each other and you go up again. So just because we talk about these 3 stages of escalating, navigating, and deteriorating doesn't mean that you always end in deteriorating, and doesn't mean that we don't go through all of the different stages multiple times, right? So it's not necessarily only an up, over, down, right? The relationships are messy. Mentioned in the book are some extra stages. So Rollin's 6 stages of friendship. I'm not requiring that you know them, but they can be interesting if this is a topic that you'd like to know more about. So he argues that there are 6 stages of friendship. We start with role-limited interaction, which is the idea of like, oh yeah, I know you from class. And then you start friendly relations, which you start talking more, hanging out. Moving towards friendship, nascent friendship, and nascent just means basically like, okay, pretty steady. Stabilized friendship is pretty long-term. It's kind of, you know where things are at, been friends for a while. And then waning friendships, a lot of our friendships wane and end over time, right? Not all of them, but many. And then about romantic relationships, we have Knapp's relationship stages mentioned. And his are far more complex, but worth looking at. So what he calls the coming together is that navigating stage. And he says we have steps that he calls initiating and experimenting and intensifying. And then as we move into relational maintenance, we start integrating our lives together, we bond with one another. But then also we start differentiating ourselves from one another and maybe setting aside, this is my sphere, that's your sphere, these are my roles, that's your roles. And potentially coming apart, right? As we move into stagnating, things get boring, start to avoid one another and potentially ending things. But remember, you can also back up these steps, right? So if you're interested in interpersonal communication, friendships and romantic relationships are common topics, and you can spend a lot more time looking at them if you're interested. Again, my main concern is you knowing that relationships escalate, navigate, deteriorate, and what that might look like. And while I don't need you to memorize the names of these stages for Knapp and Rollins, you should have a sense of how relationships change over time. A large reason that relationships change over time is for what we call relational dialectics. Relational dialectics were defined by Floyd in 2009 as conflicts between 2 important but opposing needs or desires. What's crucial here with relational dialectics is that all couples, all friends, all families struggle with them, and we call it a dynamic knot of contradictions. It's dynamic because it's constantly changing. And so relational dialectics are a natural part of negotiating social interactions. They highlight the tension, the struggle, and the general messiness of all our personal relationships. And while we can reduce and manage dialectical tensions, we can never eliminate them. They never go away, but they can be well managed. So let's take a look at what they are. We have a few different types of relational dialectics, and these are not only in romantic relationships or friendships. I really need to stress this, right? They include any type of personal relationship. And how well you manage those tensions indicates the success of that relationship. We have 2 different categories. One are dialectics within the relationship. So these are tensions happening inside the people within the relationship. But then there's also dialectics with outsiders, and these are external dialectics. And so if we'll talk about the couple just for sake of ease. These are going to be relational dialectics that the couple experiences with outside society. So within relationships, the 3 most common that we talk about are autonomy and connection, novelty and predictability, and openness, closeness. And the three most common that we talk about when we're referring to external dialectics are inclusion and seclusion, conventionality and uniqueness, revelation and concealment. Right, so I'm going to run through all of these for you, and as I mentioned, these are the ones that most often get talked about. They're not the only ones that exist, so some others that also come up sometimes are favoritism and impartiality, instrumentality and affection, equality and inequality, and traditional and non-traditional gender roles. And I'll mention some of these in a moment. So, if we talk about internal dialectics, these are ones that happen inside the relationship, and the first is connection and autonomy. So here we have an image of Mel and Joey Schwenke, and they have matched in the same outfits for 35 years. And compare this to some cousins of mine. This is one of their Facebook posts. A little bit of background. Ben and Renata are married. They have a dog, Roxy, and a son, Seb. And so Ben posts, "If anyone with any knowledge pertaining to the location of my passport would like to step forward, be greatly appreciated." And his wife, Renata, says, "It's down the back of the drawers." Their friend Peter chimes in and says, "Do you two ever actually speak face to face?" And Ben says, no, I live downstairs with the PS4 and Max the dog. Renata lives upstairs with her Kindle and Roxy the dog. Renata says, "And I have my music. It's like we have two very small apartments and a baby." Right? And so they have their very independent, autonomous parts of life and parts of their day, whereas Mel and Joey here on the left are very, very much on that connection end. So as with most things we've talked about with dialectics, these are continuums. It's not all or nothing. And perhaps some days we're far more connected, some days we're far more autonomous, perhaps some topics we're more connected about, others we're more autonomous about. And so we'll talk about how we manage these relationships. But connection and autonomy basically means how much are we together and need to do this together, and how much can we kind of have our individual time and stand alone and be independent. The next internal dialectic is predictability and novelty. Right? So how much do you have your very set date night? It's predictable what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, versus having new and different and exciting that you're planning on doing. It's a little bit counterintuitive for me to say new and exciting and different that you're planning on doing. It's up to you how much you actually plan to do those things. But right, you get the idea of how much something is predictable versus new and different. And sometimes we can do this by saying, okay, we're going to have our date night every Wednesday, but we're going to do something different every time, right? That's one way people might manage this tension. Within the relationship, we have something we call openness and closeness refers to privacy. So openness, how much do we talk about something versus how much do we not? All right, what topics are open for discussion, with who, how deeply do we go into it? So this goes very much back to our discussion of self-disclosure. We also have external dialectics. And external dialectics, remember, are between the couple and the community surrounding them. So on the left, we have Mildred and Richard Loving. This is from 1965. And if you're familiar with Loving versus Virginia, that is the court case that made interracial marriage legal around the country. So Mildred and Richard Loving were an interracial couple, and they were legally not allowed to marry in Virginia or to be married in Virginia, and so they took the case to the Supreme Court. In a very similar case, but with some very different arguments and background behind it, recently the Supreme Court agreed that same-sex marriage is constitutional and legal around the country, and at first it was being accepted within individual states. And so in New York City in 2011, Phyllis and Connie became the first same-sex couple to marry, and that is a very new occurrence in the last few years for same-sex couples to be included in society that way rather than secluded and have their relationship not accepted. Again, an external dialectic is conventionality and uniqueness. How much are you doing things based on what society expects versus mixing things up? And when it comes to being conventional versus unique, remember that this is very culturally based, very society based. And so if you're doing something in the way that your culture does, which is very different than the dominant culture you're living in, that's going to be seen as very unique, right? Even though it might be conventional somewhere else, right? So I have here some images of classic gold wedding bands, but then I also have some tattooed wedding bands. And so when it comes on the spectrum of conventionality and uniqueness, conventional, we see gold wedding bands; unique, we see tattooed wedding bands. But very importantly, even more unique is a lot of people reject the institution of marriage entirely, right? And so they don't believe in it at all. And so their uniqueness would be even more so than tattooed wedding bands. So again, this is all happening on a continuum. And the last external dialectic we'll talk about, again, this is between the couple and the community. How much are you revealing your relationship versus hiding it? Right? So how much are you revealing it to others? Have you told your friends yet about that hookup person you have? Are you ever going to? Right? Are they very much on the concealment end? You're dating someone and that first time you decide to hang out with the other person's friends, like as a couple, it's kind of a big deal. Or that first time you change your Facebook status, right? At least a couple of years ago, that was a really big deal to announce to the world that you were actually in a relationship, is when your Facebook status changed. So in different relationships, there are different common tensions. We have different types of relationships, such as romantic, long-distance romantic relationships, friendships, even the workplace. So in romantic relationships, a really common tension is that openness versus privacy. How much do you get to know about each other and about what topics? Maybe you have an agreement to not discuss religion or politics or money. Maybe all of them. Long-distance relationships often suffer from a tension about uncertainty and certainty. Right? So how much do you know about the other person's life? How much do you know what they're engaging in compared to what you said you're going to engage in? Friendships, what we call instrumentality versus affection, is another one that comes up in the workplace. And what this means is how much do you genuinely have affection for this other person versus how much are you having friends or have a relationship together because you're useful for one another, right? You keep that friend around because you know they can get you discount concert tickets versus, yeah, this is totally a person I would choose to hang out with at every chance I get, right? So instrumentality versus affection. Some others we experience in the workplace: impartiality versus favoritism, and openness versus privacy. It's a really big deal at work. How much do your coworkers know about you? How much do you want them to know about you? So, as I mentioned, we have multiple types of tensions, and they're going to occur differently in different relationships, but tensions always occur in relationships, and they do not simply go away. We can manage them. Now, dialectical tensions are an old and complex enough theory that we end up with, as you've seen, some slightly different vocabulary, even talking about the same thing. And we also end up with a pretty long list of different ways to manage dialectical tensions. What I've given you here are the 4 that most commonly get talked about. The first is neutralization, and so by this we manage our dialectical tensions by trying to neutralize them, by trying to balance them. And so this is the version of compromising, and compromising, remember, means you both give a little bit up. So yeah, okay, you're mostly getting what you want, but not entirely, right? So neutralization, we both want to go to a movie, you wanted to go to that romantic comedy that's out. I wanted to go to shallow plotline, big explosions, and instead we choose the who's funny right now, right? The kind of pseudo action comedy one. So neither of us are quite getting what we want, but kind of, sort of. Right? So that's neutralization. You're trying to balance the opposing forces. Separation is that you choose one or the other, right? And this is where you basically think time is how you're choosing them. So maybe this week we're going to do what I want, next week we're going to do what you want, right? This time I get to choose vacation, next time you get to choose vacation, right? So you alternate and favor each need in turn, right? So maybe today we're going to spend our time together, and then tomorrow we're each going to go do our own separate hobbies, right? I'm going to go climbing, you're going to go ride your bike, right? So separation is time-wise. You're going to separate the opposing forces and just focus on one at a time. In controlling relationships, what ends up happening is you end up not alternating, and one person's needs are consistently met while the other person's is not. Segmentation is that you recognize in various contexts, not necessarily time, but context-based, how to handle the tensions differently. So perhaps we're dating and in class we don't make out. We're often not in groups together, but then once our class ends, then of course we hold hands and are physically affectionate, right? But those are different contexts, not necessarily time-based, but situation-based. Perhaps it's around some friends we're like this, around other friends we're like this, or around friends we're close, around family we definitely maintain a respectful distance. Right? And then the last of these, which takes the most time but is the most effective in the long run, is called reframing. And what this means is that you're learning to see the tension in a completely different way. You're actually talking about it and thinking about your opposing needs in a positive way. And so not just saying, well, you want something different than I do, you're saying, okay, that we want different things, or that, this is happening. How can we think about this in a positive way? So for instance, if we weren't so close, we wouldn't be having all these problems, is a pretty consistent one that people see. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? We're not happy about the long time we spend apart and the high levels of autonomy that we have, but it means that we get to be that much more connected and that much more close when we do get to see each other. So neutralization, separation, segmentation, and reframing are 4 major ways to manage dialectical tensions. I suggest looking up some others. There's a lot of different ways that you can go about it. And because dialectical tensions are so consistent in our relationships, it's important to not only be able to recognize that they exist, but to also think about how can we manage this in a way that is supportive of both of our needs. On the flip side of that are controlling relationships. Both romances and friendships and even workplaces can become controlling and abusive, and these are topics worth a specific conversation. So, see the other supplemental lecture about the dark side of communication.